Welcome to Cambridge Forum. Tonight we'll be discussing the book United States versus George Bush et al. With Elizabeth de la Vega. I'm Jay Wexler, Associate Professor of Law at Boston University School of Law. Americans expect to be protected from fraudulent business practices and deceptive marketing by federal law. For example, investors and employees cheered when Enron executives were convicted of conspiracy to defraud in their financial claims. Could a similar indictment be made of the Bush administration's public claims that led the American people to accept the war in Iraq? Elizabeth de la Vega, a former federal prosecutor with 21 years' experience in handling criminal fraud cases, thinks yes. In her new book, U.S. versus George Bush et al., she details her legal reasoning. Written as an actual presentation to a federal grand jury, she presents the case for indicting the Bush administration on one charge: conspiracy to defraud the United States in violation of Title VIII, U.S. Code, Section 371. Elizabeth de la Vega was a federal prosecutor for 21 years before she retired in 2004. She served as assistant U.S. attorney in Minneapolis and later as a member of the Organized Crime Strike Force and branch chief in San Jose, California. She writes regularly for Tom Dispatch, and her articles have appeared in The Nation, The Los Angeles Times, The Christian Science Monitor, Salon, and Mother Jones. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Elizabeth de la Vega.
Thank you all. You know, with all of you fanning out there, it looks like the courtroom scene from To Kill a Mockingbird. But I'm really delighted to be here, and thanks. And I'm very grateful that all of you decided to come, even though this is such a warm room. I ended up here as the result in part of my new friend Michael Cantor, who's sitting over here from Cambridge Naturals, who made arrangements with Pat Zerke, and I don't know where Pat went, but I want to thank both of them and the board of Cambridge Forum, and also Professor Wexler for agreeing to moderate the program. The topic this year of the series is This America? And I want to tell you that that is actually precisely the question that my husband asked. He's a native Californian. The first time I brought him to Boston and we tried to drive, he said, "Is this America?" And in particular, well, first of all, he didn't know what anybody was saying half the time, but also the concept of this driving technique where people make a left turn without any warning in front of you at any time, no turn signal from the far right lane, was just something he'd never known in his part of America. But Massachusetts is home to me, so I understood this system, if you can call it a system, very well. And I'm very happy to be back here. I moved away many years ago, but when I do come back, there are several things that I try to do immediately. The first one is to get some fried clams. That's not hard to do because there's a place about every 10 blocks. The second thing I try to do is get some Dunkin' Donuts iced coffee. That's not hard because there's a place every 10 yards. And the third thing I try to do, which is really the most important one, not every 10 yards maybe, but close, is to go to Concord. And it's not because of the Revolutionary War history, which is interesting to me, but it's because of Louisa May Alcott. When I growing up in Needham, Louisa May Alcott was a childhood hero of mine, and she still is a hero of mine. And partly because I loved her novels about these brave young women, but also because I was really enamored of the whole tradition of rational discourse and ideas and ideals that the Alcotts and Emerson and Thoreau and the entire group of amazing people who lived in that time and place exemplified. So getting prepared today, I gave a lot of thought to Louisa May Alcott, and it seems to me, and I'm sure it seems to all of you, and it's probably a good reason why you're here today, that this idea of the honest exchange of ideas based on facts and truth is a scarce commodity, especially in recent years. And equally scarce is the concept that each American not only has a civic responsibility to be informed and to speak out about his or her opinions based on those facts, but also the idea that it will make a difference. I think we are in a time where people feel uniquely powerless, and it is those two concepts, both of which seem quite obvious, really, but they seem to not actually be carried out in practice. The idea that there's a value to rational discourse based on the truth and facts, and the idea that there is a power in the individual voice. Those are the two ideas that prompted me to write this book, U.S. versus George W. Bush. As you heard, I spent 21 years as a prosecutor, 11 years in Minneapolis, and 10 years in San Jose, and I don't know why I keep moving west, but after writing this book, I'll probably end up somewhere really far west in the Witness Protection Program or something. But part of my experience was with the Organized Crime Strike Force, which really came in handy when I was putting this case together. I was working as an assistant U.S. attorney in the summer of 2002 when President Bush came out in July, and he spoke about the Enron case. And as you will recall, the Enron company pretty much fell apart in the fall of 2001, and that led to a flurry of discussion about new legislation. And President Bush came out with one of his standard backdrops that told people what to think in case they couldn't understand what he was saying. And the concept was corporate responsibility. And Bush announced that thenceforth, or from then on, whatever term he used, corporate officials would be required to tell the truth. And this kind of befuddled me because that actually already was the law. But what I didn't know at the time, and what most people didn't know at the time in July of 2002, this was July 30th, he made this speech, was that the president and Cheney and Rumsfeld and Powell and Rice and so many people in the highest levels of our government were about to embark on the largest fraud imaginable, one far worse than the Enron fraud, far graver in scope and far more disastrous in consequences. Because as the president said when he talked about Enron, he said, well, tricking investors into making investments is a crime, and people should be held accountable if they fail to tell the truth about the status of their corporation. Well, clearly, I think we can all agree that tricking the nation and actually the entire world into a war against a country that was 8,000 miles away that had done nothing to us is equally a crime, if not more so, of course. By the time I took early retirement in the fall of 2004, I knew in a general sense and in somewhat of a specific sense that the administration had deceived the public about the country, about the war, and they had defrauded the country. So it was at that point that I really finally had time to look at the TV news. I really had not done that before, and I kind of regretted it when I actually did it because it was so appalling, but it gave me a pretty good understanding of the nature of the discussion and how it was that there could even be a question about whether the president had intentionally deceived the public. And there were three things that seemed to be accepted as truth, even by people who were critics of the president. They were people who did not support the president, but they were these very so-called sophisticated pundits who opine on television about what we should all consider to be the accepted truth about our government. And the first one was that the president could not have lied because he didn't know anything. And he didn't know anything, in part, according to this theory, because he relied on his subordinates and he never read anything. And therefore, he was off the hook for responsibility. And that was what people seemed to agree upon as something that would be exculpating. It would be something that would let the president not have culpability for his actions. Well, believe it or not, in any fraud case, virtually any fraud case, that is a defense. And it doesn't matter if it's an Enron kind of fraud or home improvement fraud or any kind of fraud you can imagine involving medical treatments, across the board. And in fact, this was one of the defenses that Ken Lay and Jeffrey Skilling used in the Enron case. They said, we just relied on our underlings, and we believed in the end that Enron would pull through and that it would ultimately be profitable. Well, that's such a common defense. It is actually a jury instruction in cases. And the point is, in any fraud case, it's somebody who's in a position of authority who sets about to make a representation to the public has an obligation to make sure that there's a reasonable basis, not just a little fact somewhere, but a reasonable basis that would justify that statement. And if they fail to do that, that is considered, and juries are told this in every fraud case, that is equal to fraud. That's a form of fraud. It's called making a statement with reckless disregard for the truth. So that was one of these accepted pundit beliefs or tenets. The second one was that the administration officials, particularly Bush and Cheney, according to the pundits, believed that there were weapons of mass destruction. Therefore, they could not be held responsible for deceiving the public. Believe it or not, again, that's something in an analogous way that people say in almost every fraud case. They say something along the lines of, well, I thought the whole thing was going to work out, and therefore you just have to let me off the hook for what I said along the way to get people to agree to it. Well, that, again, is something that doesn't fly. And the thing about the law is that it actually reflects common sense. And what the juries are told in that regard is that basically you can't mislead people to get them to do what you want them to do or what you want them to think just because you think that's going to be good for them in the end, just because you think that your ultimate goal is going to work out. So that's another defense that would not work in a fraud case. And then the third thing that the pundits all seem to agree upon and influenced the public to agree upon the same thing was, well, the president never said anything that was outright false. He said things that were technically true, so he should be let off the hook for that reason. Well, there are a couple of problems with that. One is that the president said many things that were outright false. But more than that, again, common sense. The law of fraud reflects the fact that everybody knows that telling an outright lie is really the worst way to deceive people. You know that if you're a teenager or if you have teenagers. Because if you say, you know, I was at so-and-so's house when you were actually out in the woods drinking or whatever somebody might have been doing, it's easily disproved. It's much more effective to deceive people in slightly trickier ways by saying something that's a half-truth or leaving out an important part of the evidence that people need to know about, or simply just wording things in a way that doesn't actually even assert any fact, but it comes out in a deceitful way. And one example of that is in a Listerine ad that many of you are old enough to remember, which was on the label. It used to say, kills germs on contact, and then the next sentence would say, good for colds and sore throats. Well, that led everybody to think that Listerine would cure sore throats and colds. Well, it didn't cure sore throats and colds, and they had to remove that ad. So it's my belief, both as an individual citizen and as a lawyer, that we should hold the president and our highest officials to a higher standard than that which we hold our advertisers, especially for cold medicines. So that's another thing that juries are actually told. So I listen to the pundits talk about all this stuff on TV and agree smugly that these are the reasons why the president shouldn't be held responsible for the same kind of deceit, except on a much more massive level than people are prosecuted for around the country every single day, every single week. And I was also aware, just from a partial reading of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, that we had more than enough information already, even though we never got phase 2, which was, we still haven't gotten phase 2. But phase 1 was the report that analyzed a lot of the evidence that was available at the time. But because the volume of this information was so confusing and so large, I thought, well, maybe I can offer some assistance here in helping people understand how the law would apply to this type of case. Now, the law of fraud doesn't prohibit fraud in any situation by our executive branch, but there is a statute which Professor Wexler talked about, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and it's in Title 18, United States Code Section 371, and it prohibits using fraud that's directed at interfering with a branch or government of a branch or agency of government. And of course, Congress was a branch of government, and we're hoping it will continue to be. So that is the statute I used to analyze the pre-war intelligence, and because there were so many narratives that had already been written about this and legal analyses, I decided to do it in a way that was a little more accessible to the average person. I wanted it to be down to earth. And so I decided to use the same format that I would use in a grand jury. And that's basically the testimony of agents. And in this case, I had to make up fictional agents, but nothing else about the case other than the fact that there is such a case and that the indictment, which, by the way, is in the beginning of the book. It's in gray, and it is a hypothetical indictment, but many people find it therapeutic just to read it. So I spent about 10 months reading everything that was on the various White House websites, the State Department, Department of Defense, and it was kind of an obsessive-compulsive task, I admit it, for a period that lasted right after 9/11 through the middle of 2004. And from all those documents, I made one huge timeline, because the essence of any fraud is the discrepancy between what people say and do publicly and what they know and say and do behind the scenes. It's pretty much common sense. And then I read all these various reports, Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, 9/11, and so forth, and I made a behind-the-scenes timeline. And in choosing the facts that I put in the behind-the-scene timeline, I was very careful to exclude anything that depended on an opinion, because so often on TV, we would hear somebody like Paul O'Neill, the former Treasury Secretary, or Richard Clark, the former terrorism czar, and they would make statements and they would be attacked, and we totally lost touch with the substance of the conversation. So I didn't want to have any facts that depended on an individual. And through this process, I was able to present the whole set of circumstances, starting with even before the election, even before President Bush was a governor. I didn't start with birth or anything of the president, but I started in early 1991 when Cheney and Libby and Wolfowitz began talking about the precepts of this group called Project for a New American Century, when they were talking about American U.S. predominance in the world and the fact that we were entitled to oil in the Middle East and so forth. And I go all the way through the campaign before 9/11 and after 9/11. And all of this is with a view towards enabling the reader, who is in the position of the grand jurors, to answer this question. And I'm going to read it, even though it's really a mouthful. But the question in the book is there probable cause to believe that Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Rice, Powell, and others used deceit, craft, trickery, dishonest means, including lies, false pretenses, misrepresentations, deliberate omissions, half-truths, false promises, and statements made with reckless disregard for the truth to obstruct or interfere with Congress in their deliberations about the war relating to the invasion of Iraq. And I don't know if any of you saw the Colbert Report, but he said that was a big deal. But so it is a mouthful, this question, but the answer is really simple. And I leave the answer in the book to the reader, but for all of you, I'm going to tell you that the answer is yes. And the evidence is overwhelming, and I'm not going to go through it all here. Many of you know about it, but we know that when Vice President Cheney told the public in December 2001 that it was pretty well confirmed, and for the radio listeners, I'm going like this with my fingers, making quotation marks, pretty well confirmed that Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker, had met with the head of Iraqi intelligence in Prague. It wasn't pretty well confirmed. It hadn't even been investigated. And I can tell you, as a prosecutor, if I said something like that in an affidavit for a search warrant, that something was confirmed and it hadn't been investigated, I would be prosecuted. I would lose my job. And there's a fellow in Michigan right now who's under indictment for that very thing. We know that when administration officials were saying that the president hadn't decided whether to go to war, we'd already been at war for months and months. Donald Rumsfeld had already authorized 50 airstrikes likely to kill more than 30 Iraqi civilians by July of 2002. We know that when Cheney and Wolfowitz were telling the public in the spring of 2002 that there was this relationship between Iraq and 9/11, Wolfowitz, and we know this from memos written by the British, that Wolfowitz was telling the British, well, I think there's a relationship between Iraq and 9/11. Do you guys have any evidence of that? Do you have any information we can use to make this assertion? We know that when Cheney was telling people that we knew about chemical weapons in Iraq because his son-in-law told us, Saddam Hussein's son-in-law told us, well, the other half of that report, which is only like a page and a half, said that Saddam Hussein's son-in-law had also told us at the very same time that those chemical weapons had been destroyed. That's a half-truth. We know that when Rice was telling people about these aluminum tubes, that they were only suited for nuclear weapons, there was report after report that said, no, they're not suited for nuclear weapons. In fact, they're about as easily used for a centrifuge as Yugo could be turned into a Cadillac. That's what the information was. And that's the same kind of statement that Colin Powell told the UN and the whole world about these aluminum tubes. And he said some people, including the Iraqis, believe that these tubes are usable for rockets. Well, the some people he was talking about were his own agents at the State Department. He lumped them together with the Iraqis in an attempt to denigrate the concept that was overwhelmingly proved by the reports that he had available to him. And we know that when Bush was telling people about the UN that we had to invade Iraq, this is in March of 2003, we had to invade Iraq because they weren't cooperating with the inspections. We know that the inspectors were begging for us not to invade Iraq because the inspections were working. These are not mistakes. There's nothing remotely resembling mistakes in any of these things, and that's just a fraction. So we know that this crime has occurred. We know it's continuing every day. Last week, President Bush talked about this, made implications about Iraq being connected to 9/11 27 times in a speech. So this crime has occurred. It's ongoing. And in my book, I talk about Kitty Genovese. And I know many of you know about that story. Kitty Genovese was a woman who was walking home in 1964 in Queens, and she was stabbed repeatedly and killed. And during that incident, which lasted for a fairly long time, there were 38 neighbors who heard or saw what was going on, and nobody called the police. Now, there was a study done about that, and the study found that it wasn't that people were indifferent. They weren't. It was that they assumed someone else would do something about it, or even worse, they assumed that if no one else was doing anything about it, it couldn't be as bad as it sounded. Well, we know that this is as bad as it sounds. Right. And I was getting to that. We know that 650,000 to 1 million Iraqis have been killed. We know that there are 2 million Iraqis who've been displaced. We know that 3,200 American soldiers have been killed, and more people are getting killed every single day. We also know that this conduct not only constitutes a crime in a statutory sense, but it also constitutes a high crime and misdemeanor in the language of impeachment. And that is a standard that's only vaguely defined, but it's a powerful one, and it's what it means is an egregious abuse of executive power that goes directly to the governance of the country. It's hard to think of a more egregious abuse of executive power than defrauding the entire public about the war, as this administration has done. So what are we to do? People ask me this question all the time, and I'm sure somebody will ask me again after I'm done, even though I'm going to answer it to some degree. The Democrats say impeachment is off the table. Nancy Pelosi says impeachment is off the table. Well, the members of Congress are public servants. They work for us. We need to tell them what we want. And we can't wait around and wait for our opinions to be reflected in some poll that's taken somewhere. And we can't assume that Congress is going to save us from this administration. They are definitely not going to save us unless we throw them a life raft. We need to throw them many life rafts. We need to tell them that we do not want them strategizing about or for their own political gain in the face of an ongoing crime. We need to tell them we don't want them strategizing about whether to end this war in the hopes that that will help them in the next election. It's 21 months till the next election, and that is precisely the amount of time that is covered in my book, the time it took the administration to start this marketing campaign for the war and to carry it through to the so-called mission accomplished. 20 months, 21 months. We need to tell them that they need to hold this administration accountable, if that's what you believe. And if it leads to impeachment, then so be it. And this is no small thing for each of us to stand up and say what we believe. It's not easy. It's not easy at all. In fact, one of the people I've been fortunate to meet in the course of my journey here is Daniel Ellsberg. And he told me, and he's written about this as well, that it was very difficult for him to go from being this government official or government employee to someone who was speaking out, partly because he didn't want to set himself apart from the crowd. It was embarrassing. Well, people feel that way, and that's a legitimate way to feel. So it is no small thing to take this step. But it's also no small thing to do. It's extraordinarily important. And we need to each decide, is it important enough for us to want to hold this administration accountable that we're going to take the time to write a letter? Because that's what we need to do. You need to write a letter to your congresspeople. And I've been told that writing a letter is 100-fold more powerful than signing a petition or sending an email. Someone who takes the time to write a letter to his or her congressman has made a powerful statement. And maybe it won't be your letter or your phone call that will turn the tide, but we don't know. And more important, just standing up for your own values and what you believe in these most critical of matters is priceless just in and of itself. And we talk about, is this America? We have been sitting and listening and hearing these horrendous things for so many years, and each of us has been saying to ourselves and to others, is this America that is torturing people? Is this America that is kidnapping people and sending them to places we know, where we know they're going to be tortured? Is this America where the president spies on his own citizens and he admits it and no one does anything about it? So what reflects the best of America is when we all stand up and do this really, certainly not a time-consuming thing, but an invaluable thing. And that leads me back to my friend, Louisa May Alcott. I mentioned that I met Daniel Ellsberg, another person I met in the course of this strange adventure that led me from being a federal prosecutor to talking about indicting the president. Is a woman named Kit Bakke, and she has written a book called Miss Alcott's Emails, and it's a lovely book. And as one sign of how bad a business person I am, I'm promoting her book and really not talking about my own, but it's a good book. And in it is a letter from Louisa May Alcott that she wrote in 1885, and she was writing to a woman who was criticizing Miss Alcott, for not doing enough for women's suffrage. And so Louisa May Alcott wrote back, and she was kind of defending herself, and she was saying, well, I'm doing as much as I can, and certainly this is equally important to me as the anti-slavery activities that I took. And after going through that, Louisa May Alcott said, if I can do no more, let my name stand among those who are willing to bear ridicule and reproach for the truth's sake, and so earn some right to rejoice when victory is won. And she signed it, yours for ending women's suffrage and for all other reforms. So if I can paraphrase Ms. Alcott, let me close by saying, I remain and I stand here most heartily yours for ending the war and for presidential accountability and all other reforms as well. So thank you.
You are listening to Cambridge Forum with Elizabeth de la Vega discussing United States versus George Bush et al. And so my task, one of my tasks as moderator is to come and ask a question or two to start the questioning off, which is not a very easy thing to do because I read the book and I said, yeah, that sounds pretty much right. And so coming up with a question is not very easy. It's really a tremendous book and it's a devastating critique of the administration, particularly the aluminum tubes section of the book is just, it's priceless. So, but I've got to ask my question. So I decided maybe I'll play devil's advocate a little bit, see how this goes. So I have two questions, and one question is about the how you chose to present the argument, and then the other is about the argument itself. Okay. So the first is about why you chose the grand jury proceeding in particular for your presentation. In the book, at the beginning, you discuss your goals, and you say it's impossible to have a productive debate about these issues in the press and in public because spin so much overwhelms substance that it's just impossible, right? But in the courtroom, we don't have that, right? We expect people to look at the facts and have a reasoned discussion, and it's not about spin; it's about the facts and the issues. And you say that we expect. This is what you say. We expect, and the law requires that people hear all the evidence before deciding, hence this hypothetical grand jury presentation. So my question, I guess, is why would you choose the grand jury specifically if you want people to decide upon all of the evidence? Because defendants, right, don't have the right to present evidence in the grand jury. They can't cross-examine witnesses. They're not even allowed to be there. So if I was one of the defendants, I would say, how can you say that that the reader should consider all of the evidence, but then proceed to show them just one side of the evidence? And so I was wondering, as I read it, did you ever consider writing a trial book or something where you had the other side get up or otherwise engage those arguments?
The reason I chose this format, there were several reasons. One is that my goal in writing the book was not to say, for example, that President Bush should be indicted because there are constitutional problems with that in the first place. My goal was not even to say that any of these other people should be indicted. My goal was to illuminate the facts as we know them, the ones that are undisputed, and explain what the law was. And not even to convict these people, of course, but to rather to motivate and hopefully get people to push their Congress people to have the hearings that we need. So it was more of a way of beginning a debate, not ending it. And so the standard of proof in a grand jury proceeding is there probable cause. It's not, is there proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And so it's true, the grand jury proceeding does not have the other side in there, but that's because its goal is not to ultimately convict. And the proceeding that would have to follow, if there were an indictment, of course, would be a trial, and then you would have both sides. Or if there were impeachment hearings in Congress, then there would be more of that proceeding as well. Also, I wanted to be able to finish the book.
Fair enough. All right, so my second and last question before I open it up to the audience is about the issue itself. And this, I guess, maybe this is the law professor in me asking, but I was curious about the distinction between the statements that you document that the administration made directly to Congress, as opposed to the statements that were made to the American public, because it seems to me that could be an important distinction. The statute that you're using, as you say, only prohibits defrauding the United States. Mm-hmm. It's not a general fraud statute. You have to defraud the United States or an agency, and I assume that Congress counts as an agency. I'm not so sure, though, that defrauding the people is quite as easy a link as it might seem. In the book, you say the link here, I think, and maybe you say some other things, but what caught my eye was the argument that the defendants were trying, and it's fun to keep saying defendants, intended to influence the outcome of the 2002 elections, congressional elections, and also to influence the vote on authorizing the use of force. And so that's the link between the public statements and defrauding Congress. But that seems a little indirect to me. And so I'm wondering, is there a hard legal issue in there, do you think, in which you have to draw the link between defrauding the public and defrauding the Congress? And if you were to resolve that issue in such a way that you would allow an indictment on fraud, I know that that's not quite your point, but through interpreting that statute to allow public fraud to count, would that have any negative consequences for other areas? For example, I can imagine if that's the right interpretation of that statute, you could have a journalist who writes an article and leaves something out because he or she wants to influence an election, and does that all of a sudden become a fraud in the United States?
Well, the key to that, and that is a really important point on the legal analysis. But the administration officials actually answered that question themselves, because what they said on September 6th, and I didn't go through all of this in detail, but on September 6th of 2002, right before this marketing plan was laid out in full force, Karl Rove and Andy Card were interviewed by the New York Times, and they said that, and I don't know why they said this, but they said, we are setting about to essentially market our plan for war, and our goal is to influence the public and to influence the Congress with the idea that Congress will vote to authorize the use of military force within 5 to 6 weeks. So, and they said, in the end, it will be difficult for Congress to vote against it. So from their own statements, they were essentially admitting all of our marketing campaign, regardless of whether it's in the form of testimony to Congress or in the form of public speeches all around the country or to the press, all of it is geared towards getting the public to pressure Congress, towards influencing Congress directly, and simultaneously getting Congress to do what they wanted.
Thank you. Okay, so why don't we open it up to the audience? You're joining Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion with Elizabeth de la Vega on United States versus George Bush et al., her hypothetical indictment of the Bush administration on charges of criminal fraud. So let's take some questions from the audience. Remember to line up at the microphone in the aisle, and let's just begin.
Hello, thank you. And I was wondering if you have sent the book to Nancy Pelosi, and if you would be willing to try to get to meet with her as she's read or gone through the book and try to present the case and get your own powerful influence to start some impeachment proceedings. Thank you.
Thanks. Did you want me to answer?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Actually, I know of at least 7 different people who've sent Nancy Pelosi the book. So I don't know if she's read it. But I actually am in the process of working with a group of people who would like me to meet with her. And it may happen even this week. So. Thank you.
My name is Michael Brower. You've half or 3/4 answered my question, which is about impeachment.
Okay.
11 days ago at Faneuil Hall, there was a citizens' rally to impeach Bush and Cheney, one of many, many around the country, and I was one of the invited speakers. I have copies. If you want to catch me after the meeting, give me your email address, and I'll email it to you, or if you rather have a hard copy, postal address. In it, I outline, I had 15 causes of impeachment, and I gave up. I wanted to keep it on one page. And you may be glad to know that my very first was lying about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction by seeking uranium in Africa, having aluminum tubes, things you raise in your book. I cite your book here, but I didn't get it until after I wrote and gave the speech. I would like to close with a question, but first I would like to read to folks, because I'm 75 years old and I grew up during World War II. I am saying we must move now to impeach because the Germans woke up after World War II and asked, how did we let this happen? Why did we let this happen? And folks, we are the Germans of today. I don't want us in a week, a month, a year, 5 years, or our children to ask us, why did we let this happen? We must impeach now. And as I say, if you want to get a hold of me, give me an email address or an address.
Thank you.
To give you a question. Your book is either completely or almost completely about your simulation of a court process for criminal behavior. You have mentioned impeachment, fortunately. Would you encourage citizens, I think you already did, but I'd like to hear it again, to really pressure the U.S. Congress, which is falling down on its job to uphold the Constitution, and pressure our congressmen and women to impeach?
I think that's what I just did.
Hi, my name is Stephen Brush.
Hi.
And first want to identify myself as a writer. I'm from Rockport and Cape Ann. And before I give you a yes, I echo you back your yes, I want to identify myself as a military veteran. I had almost 4 years service during the Vietnam War, including 5 months in South Korea during the 1968 Pueblo crisis. I'm bringing that up because at the time I was part of a team. We went to get our men back, and there were 83 men in the North who were there for 11 months, and they were tortured. Just want to give you a narrative.
I think people might be having a hard time hearing you, sir.
Okay. In April of 2000, I left Boston, Haley House, a Catholic worker house. I returned to Rockport, where I used to live. Somewhere along the line, I went down to Boston College, St. Ignatius Church. Thomas Gumbleton was there. He was then a bishop from Detroit. He was the only Catholic bishop, I believe, that was against the war. And I stood with him then. I'm standing here now. I don't want to speak long. I want to be brief. On Patriots' Day, I finished 7 years of work against gun violence, for gun safety. During that 7-year period, I was banned from the Rockport Library for about 18 months. I was put on trial. Eventually, it was dismissed. So not only do I say yes to your yes, I say yes to what Daniel Ellsberg said. I've been with him. I was at a Veterans for Peace conference at Faneuil Hall. I'm not a member of that organization, but I was with him. Very difficult to speak out about some of the stuff. Catch-22s come up. So I'm grateful to be here and grateful to give a yes.
Thank you for your service.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Quinlan. What effect do you believe that the A, impeachments, or B, non-impeachments of George W. Bush and members of his administration will have on the standing and reputation of the United States of America internationally? And what effect do you believe that the impeachment or non-impeachment of the Bush administration will have on the American people?
Well, they're both related, of course. I think the main reason that I would encourage people to push for impeachment is that we cannot go around the world as the promoters of democracy and the model of democracy if we do not have a democracy and if we do not act as if we have a democracy in this country. And I know that our standing around the world is already quite dubious. People are just amazed that we reelected the president in the first place, if that actually happened, and also that we are just sitting by and letting all these horrific things happen. We certainly can't be criticizing other countries for torture if that's exactly what we're doing. And I think the same thing applies for the people of the United States, because believe it or not, we could have a president who decides to arrogate even more power onto himself if we don't draw the line at this point. So it's really getting back to something that's not at all radical, but really what the basis of the Constitution is, that there are checks and balances and that impeachment is the remedy for executive abuse.
And so what effect do you think that it will have on our international standing specifically?
Well, I think I answered that in the first part of my answer. Thank you.
It's interesting that you say that you started your timeline for this book in '91. As I'm sure you must be aware, all throughout the '90s, Iraqis were suffering terribly from the consequences of executive deceit and its implications in the form of criminal and sanctions that were imposed by the Clinton administration, which were killing 5,000 to 6,000 Iraqis, mainly children, by the best estimates of the WHO. In fact, when Dennis Halliday, the UN humanitarian commissioner in Iraq, resigned in protest in '98, he made the following statement. He said that he resigned because the human calamity going on in Iraq today on account of widespread deprivation caused by U.S.-driven economic sanctions. I've been using the word genocide because this is a deliberate policy to destroy the people of Iraq. I'm afraid I have no other view. This was long before Bush came into power, and these types of criminal activities in U.S. statecraft have been going on all the way back to Woodrow Wilson. So is it really something that we want to single out just the current perpetrators? No doubt Rice and Bush and Powell deserve the same fate as Saddam Hussein. But don't Clinton and Albright and Cohen also, haven't they earned their right to the gallows? Shouldn't we impeach the whole criminal U.S. bipartisan imperialist system, including Nancy Pelosi and Obama and Hillary and the rest who have also shown support for the Iraq War?
Well, I wrote one book. And
will you write a companion edition about the Iraq sanctions since you started in '91 and the culpability of the Democratic regime?
Well, every individual has to determine the limits of what you can do at a certain time. This is what I chose to work on, and I don't disagree with much of what you're saying, but I encourage you to write a book if you'd like to do that.
Well, the books have been written, but no one was asking for impeachment for Clinton under those conditions.
Hi, my name is Eric Brisson. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
I don't know how likely impeachment is, but the nightmare that keeps coming to me when I think of impeaching President Bush and the worry that I have about impeaching President Bush and Vice President Cheney and others is what happens if we just impeach President Bush? Is there a strategic way to make sure that Cheney doesn't become president?
Right. Well, Dennis Kucinich has proposed a resolution, which is 333, which would go after Cheney first. And there's nothing also to prevent impeachment of both of them at the same time.
As long as one comes before the other, that's the...
No, it could happen at the same time.
Oh,
but the main thing to remember about impeachment, and this really is a crucial thing, especially if you're talking to other people about it, is that it's a process. It's not, it doesn't mean just grabbing the people and taking them out with a hook. It's really a process of inquiry. And Barbara Jordan, actually, when she introduced the articles of impeachment against Nixon, referred to it as an inquisition, which has a lot of negative connotations, but in its just neutral meaning, it just means a process of investigation. So, and there are a lot of steps along the way, and that has value in and of itself, in that it illuminates all these facts and gets people able to look at what's going on in a way that's not completely distorted by the media. So. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but it's a good question.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Elizabeth. I'm John Wunjo. Pleased to meet you.
Oh, hi, John.
I'm grateful for your book, as many of us are. I've been working on this issue of contacting congressmen and also sending copies of information about your book to all of the impeached organizations. I sent a copy of a letter to my congressman, Capuano, here in Cambridge, and I got back a form letter that showed that he never read it, and it was the subject that they covered and they thought my letter was about, which wasn't mentioned in the letter, was a letter about the difficulty of impeachment. That was not the topic. So I'm following up on that now and trying to get an interview with them or get something through the mail that relates to this presentation of yours in terms of the indictment process. And I'm just saying that people are going to find it very difficult to do what you're suggesting. That is, this whole process that's taking place now, my worst nightmare is that George Bush is going to wake up one morning and we're going to hear him say, the American people had their shot. They tried to impeach me, and it fell flat on the ground, fell right through. And that's a dangerous situation for us to be in. Even with Kucinich presenting this bill, 333, 2 weeks ago today in Congress, we stand the chance of finding this thing a huge fraud, basically. And I'm concerned about that.
Well, we can't predict everything that's going to happen. All I can suggest to people is that they do what they think is right and let the chips fall where they may.
Fair enough.
Hi, my name is Matt Merkus. My main question is, I know we have about 21 months to do something before Bush is leaving office anyway, but I know that it's a long process, an inquisition. So from your experience, what do you think the kind of timeline would be to get something to actually happen, or would it be more just kind of a statement that happens at the very end that says we're not going to put up with this kind of fraud?
I think if that's the only thing that happens, that there's a statement that we're not going to put up with this, we're not going to put up with our government torturing people, we're not going to put up with the president purporting to sign laws and then making signing statements that completely eviscerate the law. If that's what happens, I think that's better than nothing.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Great talk. My name's Ramona Hamblin, and actually I'm involved in a couple of campaigns that I think are really, cute and can get people interested. If anybody wants to give me their email address, I'm happy to do that. I'm for impeaching Cheney first. I don't care so much about conviction. I think impeachment hearings with this man as the main target would be the best television ever. It would have the beautiful blonde spy and torture. I mean, it's unbelievably gripping story to be told on national television. So when I wrote my congressman, what I'm trying to understand is why Congress, facing the American outrage over the last couple of elections, why Congress, the Democrats, aren't more concerned about securing their place in addressing this. So when I wrote to Barney Frank, this is what he wrote back. He said, we're not going to get a supermajority for conviction. I don't care about that. He said, and I quote, "This is particularly the case because sadly many of the things that this administration has done wrong were in fact done with the concurrence of many members of Congress, almost all Republicans and unfortunately a few Democrats. That is, some members of Congress would be in the difficult position of voting in effect to impeach themselves, and they would be reluctant to admit error to that degree." So my question to you is, for the members of Congress that are not in such a difficult position as having gone along with this fiasco for as long as it has gone on, is this the real answer? What's the real reluctance of members of Congress? What is it? I'm meeting with Barney Frank on May 25th, and I feel like this can't be correct. He's smarter than that. What is the real thing that we have to convey to our members of the House so that they understand there's really no way out? This is going to happen.
I think one of the major parts of the reluctance has to do with the fact that so many Democrats are afraid that if we start talking about impeachment of this president, all that's going to do is bring to mind the impeachment of Clinton, and who is one of the major candidates for the presidency in 2008, Hillary Clinton. So, but having said that, I think that's part of the motivation, but I think it's completely askew because the worst thing that Democrats can do is to let the Republicans take a situation where they abuse the impeachment process in the first place and then let that abuse cause them to be reluctant to use the impeachment process when it's absolutely required. So I think that is one of the reasons. Hi.
Good evening. I'm Robert Kleinberg, and thanks very much for a very interesting presentation. I actually have a legal question.
Okay.
You have examined all the evidence. You are an experienced litigator. Could you outline for us briefly the best case for G.W. Bush et al., having examined all the evidence? And I'm going to invite your co-counsel, Mr. Wexler, to jump in on that also if he's also interested in answering.
I'm not interested in. No, I'm only kidding.
As an officer of the court, you might be required.
Yeah. Oh, dear. Let's see. Well, I think the best case has to do with the arguments that I refuted in the beginning of my talk, which is that he may have subjectively believed that there were weapons of mass destruction, so he would argue that he acted in good faith. And, of course, the response would be that if you lie along the way, then you're not acting in good faith. He would also, I'm sure, make the argument, well, especially the slam dunk incident, and I'm sure everybody in this room knows what that is, but that he basically just relied on what George Tenet told him, that it was a slam dunk case. But that, I was explaining to an audience the other night, is really actually an extremely incriminating story, even if you take it at face value, because according to the story that the administration has adopted, first of all, the president wasn't briefed on the weapons of mass destruction until the end of 2002, when he'd been talking about Iraq being a grave and gathering danger for a year or more. So that's fairly incriminating right off the bat. And then it's not a sufficient answer to say, he admits in the story, well, I didn't think it was a good case. And so I said to George Tenet, well, this isn't a good case. The public isn't going to buy it. And all George Tenet says is a slam dunk. That's not enough of a response. So that has been their defense all along. And I really can't think of any other good arguments. Those weren't good arguments either.
Mr. Wexler?
Yeah, I don't have any either. There aren't any on the facts. If there is any, it might be something about the statute, which I don't understand enough about to really speak to. I mean, I think there is this question that I asked earlier on, but I don't know if that would go anywhere, and I'm not sure. I mean, a question I was going to ask, I think we maybe have enough time just to stick this in, is the statements made directly to Congress. If we assume that, for whatever reason, you can't make out the claim against the defendants based simply on their statements to the public, and you have to rely on the statements to Congress, does that weaken your case significantly, or would you say not at all? I mean, I know you have a number of pieces of evidence in the book about direct statements to Congress and the white paper incident, which was really an interesting one. But I suppose the defendants would say, yeah, maybe, but Congress, when they were deciding whether to vote on that authorization bill, they had the classified report. I mean, they didn't have very long to read it, and they had to read it in a specific place, and they couldn't comment on it. And that's not such good facts for them. But might they say, well, they had it. They had the classified material.
Yeah, they might say that, but... And I'm really sorry, it's really hard for me to answer the question you want, because I keep thinking of the responses to their defenses. But in the law of fraud, it's really not an element that has to be proved that the people were even actually deceived at all. It's just the actions of the perpetrators. So that really wouldn't be a defense in the law of fraud.
Thanks. Hello, my name is Tom Page.
Hi, Tom.
Hi. I'm leader of a group called Bostonians for the Overthrow of King George. And thank you. And as somebody else mentioned, we held a public impeachment a week and a half ago at Faneuil Hall in Boston, and a couple thousand people showed up. And we generated a couple hundred letters to congressional representatives in support of Dennis Kucinich's bill, House Resolution 333, and I encourage everyone to go to our website, mass-impeach.org, and also to write letters to their congressman or congresswoman in support of House Resolution 333. That's my plug. Now my question. The really extraordinary thing about your book is that the reader comes away with the knowledge that a company in America that wants to market even, say, a branded toothpaste
is held to a much higher legal standard in terms of fraud than our own government is when making decisions about going to war. And I was just wondering if you have any other thoughts on what we might do legally in addition to impeachment to help make our government more accountable and less capable of getting away with these propaganda and fraud campaigns.
Well, one thing is that I think that we as a society have come to expect absolutely nothing from our officials in terms of honesty. And I don't know how we can do in any formal way. I don't know how we can change that in any formal way, but I think that each of us would benefit by ceasing to have that expectation in our own minds, because we are entitled to a great deal more. And we're entitled to a great deal more from our corporate officials, and we're entitled to a great deal more from our elected officials. And certainly there are no laws about campaigns, but there are laws about when they're in government offices. So off the top of my head, I can't think of any official thing that could happen, but I'll give it some thought.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm here just to, as a personal witness and an experience that I had. I had two of them, and one was a single incident of a single individual, but another situation I had was in a restaurant. It was Harvest Co-op in Central Square, and there was a man who had a button on his hat, and it was, you know, King George and stuff like that. So we started talking, and I was talking about the impeachment of Bush, and there was 5 women there. And this one woman commented, "You're going to prison." And I said, you know, if I go to prison, I'm going to go to prison because I'm speaking the truth. You know, and I went to the GM, they didn't want to hear it. They were right-wing radical Christians. And they really believe that God is on their side, that President Bush is the equal to Abraham Lincoln, and that he is being persecuted as he was. And what I'm saying is that for me, I have, in the last four years, have dedicated myself to speak out, although there are threats, and that's here in Cambridge, by the way. So, and they are determined. They cannot see. It's like they do not want to hear the truth. And many of the things that this man and his cronies have done. In fact, this woman had mentioned Pat Robinson, and that Pat Robinson, you know, is of God. I said he also asked for the assassination of a leader of another country. What God, you know, because I'm not a Christian. And I said, if God is love, then God is love. You can't be selective in that. So that's my encouragement, is just to speak out for that spiritual hold that they are standing on, and it's unmovable in many ways. But some light has to dawn sometime, hopefully.
Well, the key is, though, that there was a poll yesterday that said 39% of the people in the country, and this is a fairly small sample, but 39% of the people already support impeachment of the president. That's with the situation where no one talks about it in the mainstream media. If everybody who already supported impeachment, if everybody even more who already believed that the president deceived us about the war, which is more than half the people in the country, if all those people became active, we don't have to worry about these other people. There's a core of people who are never going to be changed.
Right. But to speak out, no matter what. And that's what it is to have dialogue.
We have about 10 more minutes, I think. We have, so 3 fairly quick questions, and then we'll wrap up. Sound good?
Hi. My question actually has to do with the media. And going through the high school and early college years, just observing the power of the media in terms of public opinion has been incredible. And I was just wondering what your perspective was on that with something like impeachment. Would the media be a force that brings a lot of extreme left and right viewpoints and the issue gets kind of muddled, nothing happens? Or is there some way that it can be kind of like galvanized in one direction?
Well, my perception of the media right now, the mainstream media, is that it brings together a lot of extreme right-wing viewpoints, and then to balance that out, they have someone who's sort of a lukewarm moderate. I haven't seen much in the way of any progressive people on TV in any mainstream radio shows. So as far as how to get the mainstream media involved, I think it's a difficult proposition, and that's why I think we just need to go directly to Congress. We're not going to get the attention of Congress through the media. We just need to go to Congress.
Thank you.
They're letting us down.
Darlene, this is only going to make sense on the radio, but I am Ivana Moore and Moore. I'm the richly upholstered chair of the Boston Metro chapter of Billionaires for Bush.
Okay.
And darling, I've attended this. Oh, thank you. Oh, an admirer. Oh. Thank you, darling. I attended this event undercover just to make sure our interests are protected, and I have a criticism for you, young lady. You have failed to mention that both for government officials and for officers of corporations, if we don't mislead the public, we make no money.
All right, thanks. Duly noted.
And I do have a concern, darling. My concern is that by writing this book in the form of a novel, it will be distributed more widely, and our economic interests will be endangered. Shame on you. Jay, your check's in the mail. Toodles.
It's a hard act to follow. I don't know.
Yeah.
You're standing in actually the Nameless Coffee House 40th year of existence, which has been a place of activism for 40 years. Right here is the Nameless Coffee House. You know, they meet every month on Saturday. Anyways, back to the issues. What I want to ask you, maybe not from your book, but in general, do you ever address those issues of like George W. Bush's vendetta against Saddam Hussein due to Saddam Hussein's desire to assassinate his father? You know, that vendetta. Mm-hmm. Would that push this guy, you know, beyond, you know, where he's not really in control because he's so enraged that that Saddam Hussein tried to kill his father? And also, what about people who address issues of like the Rosie O'Donnell thing, or even friends I know that it was an inside job, 9/11, you know, and was the Bush administration part of making those towers go down in such a strange
I understand
way?
your
So
question.
two questions: just, do you ever address the issue of it being an inside job, and number two, do you ever address the issue of the vendetta against Saddam Hussein?
I don't address the issue of whether or not it's an inside job. As far as the motivations, the various motivations on the parts of the different administration officials, I do lay out evidence that relates to a number of motivations. One of them, of course, is the oil I mentioned before. But I do talk about President Bush's desire to avenge whatever alleged attack occurred against his father, and also to compensate for his perception or his perceived failure to follow through in Iraq in the early 90s, and also the fact that the president wanted to be a commander-in-chief. He said that was the way to be a successful president.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm tired.
Why don't we really have like about 3 or 4 minutes left, and
I think we should just end with this one.
One last question.
It's just one simple question. If Bush is not impeached and he leaves office, do we as Americans have any legal recourse to go after him after that point? Is there anything we can do?
Well, the difficulty would be to get a prosecutor to go after him. I don't know if that would happen. There's also a civil lawsuit called the Key Tam lawsuit that's potentially out there, but that's not really something I've researched, so can't help you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth De La Vega.